Chapter 1. In this first chapter, as the Buddha reappears from the palace of the Serpent King, Ravana asks for instruction about dharmas, the constituents of reality as perceived and understood by those who divide the world or their own awareness into parts, and non-dharmas, the creations of our imagination. The Buddha responds with the manifestation of a funhouse of illusion, a monumental smile and light, and finally a few words to point Ravana past dharmas and non-dharmas back to his own undifferentiated and undifferentiating mind. Chapter 2. Mahamate now rises from the assembly and asks the Buddha a series of questions. Comprising half the sutra, this second chapter introduces us to the transformation of vision, whereby external and internal worlds are seen as nothing but perceptions of our own mind. Although some commentators see this chapter as dealing with a series of unrelated topics, each section leads to the next in an orderly progression, albeit a progression that might make more sense to a practitioner than to a student of philosophy. Section 1. This marks the beginning of what most scholars think was the original form of this sutra. Section 2. This section presents what is essentially a Buddhist catechism or list of topics that would have been studied at a Buddhist vihara or academy during the period when this text was compiled, albeit a list representing all levels of knowledge from the most rudimentary to the most advanced. Some commentators have tried to see an order in the list, but I am of the opinion it is merely an example of the way the repository consciousness works. You never know what seed is going to sprout next. Section 3. In other sutras, the Buddha responds to such questions with the doctrine of relativity. Birth only exists if death exists. Since neither exists by itself, neither is ultimately real. Here, he assumes this is already understood and turns to the doctrine of negation instead. To talk about anything is to talk about nothing. This section can also be viewed as following from the Buddha's explanation of dharmas and non-dharmas to Ravana at the end of Chapter 1. Essentially, all dharmas are non-dharmas. That is, they are nothing more than arbitrary designations behind which nothing is real. Section 4. Mahamate continues by asking the same kind of question he asked before. How many kinds of this or that are there? He now asks about consciousness because the reality of its contents has just been denied. However, the Buddha did not deny consciousness itself. To do so would have been to side with those nihilists who held that nothing remained after death. Thus, while Mahamate asks about the apparent rising and ceasing of consciousness, implicit in his question is a concern with its ceasing. The Buddha answers that while consciousness rises and ceases, it possesses an intrinsic quality that remains unaffected by those forms of consciousness tied to the contents he has just now denied. Such forms are themselves delusions that can only be said to exist as long as the alaya vijnana or repository consciousness is not transformed into the Tathagata Garbha or womb of Buddhas. Section 5. Most commentators read this as a continuation of the last statement of the previous section, as a list of the something else that followers of other paths considered responsible for the continuity of consciousness. Bodhiruchi's translation is not so ambiguous. Quote, Moreover, Mahamate, followers of other paths have 7 kinds of self-existence. Close quote. However, some commentators disagree with Bodhiruchi's reading and see these as 7 examples of the Buddha's use of skillful means and conventional truth, beginning with the origination of suffering and concluding with the completion of the Eightfold Noble Path. Given the Buddha's comment in the next section concerning his establishing of both mundane and metaphysical truths in addition to transcendental truths, I have decided in favor of retaining the ambiguity. Section 6. Contrasting this with the previous section, Bodhiruchi begins, quote, I have 7 kinds of higher truth, close quote. Commentators generally agree with his interpretation, if not with his inclusion of I, that these 7 refer to 7 successive levels of understanding used in dealing with erroneous views arising from the preceding 7 forms of self-existence. Section 7. This section critiques the views regarding causation, that the effect exists in the cause or that it does not exist in the cause. Tai Chu and Yin Shun note how ridiculous such views regarding the existence or non-existence of cause and effect can be. If the result does not exist in the cause, this would be like eating but never producing shit. But if the effect exists in the cause, this would be tantamount to shit being present in food. This section mercifully ends with the transcendence of all views of causation. Section 8. This summarizes and concludes the foregoing sections.